According to the World Bank, over 430 Africans still live in extreme poverty today. It is happening right now in Africa. Every year, ships leave African ports loaded with oil, copper, cocoa, lithium, and diamond. At the same time, African countries refine fuel, refine metals, chocolate, and finished electronics, often made from their own raw material at much higher prices. Rich ground, poor people. This matters beyond Africa. Global industry depend on African resources to power the green transition and modern technology. So let's pause and ask ourselves these three questions as Africans. If Africa is so resource rich, why do most Africa not feel the richness in their life? Is poverty in Africa mainly as a result of foreign exploitation or internal choices? And what separates resource-rich African countries that struggle from those that manage to build stability? African poverty often feels confusing because the numbers don't line up with reality on the ground. The continent holds enormous wealth beneath its soil. As of 2024, Africa supplies around 30% of the world mineral reserve, including platinum, cobalt, manganese, and bauxite. Africa also produces major share of oil, gas, cocoa, coffee, and gold. Yet, most African economies remain fragile with low income and limited industrial growth. The first reason lies in how resource wealth enter the economy. In many African countries, money comes in fast and concentrated. Oil export, for example, generates billions in foreign currency, but that cash flows directly to government and small cycle of companies. It doesn't pass through factories, workshops, or small businesses where many people could earn a living. In Nigeria, oil accounts for most export earnings. Wealth exists, but jobs do not. Compare that with countries that industrialized without resources. South Korea had almost no natural resources. In the 1960s, it was poorer than many African countries. Instead of relying on what was underground, it focused on manufacturing, exports, and skills. Today, South Korea's GDP per person is above $30,000. Many resource-rich African countries remain below $3,000. Another issue is how easy money changes incentives. When government can earn revenue by exporting oil or minerals, they rely less on taxing citizens. That weakens accountability a whole lot. Leaders feel less pressure to deliver services because the state doesn't depend on people productivity. In 2023, falling oil revenue pushed several African countries under pressure, raising food and fuel prices overnight. Countries that depend on one product have little control over their own stability. Political elites, foreign buyers, and trading firms benefit from this kind of system, while young people searching for work, farmers with low incomes, and families facing rising costs are the losers. Africa's problem is not a lack of wealth. The problem is that wealth enters the economy in a narrow, unsustainable way that doesn't support broad growth. One of the quiet reasons Africa remains poor is not how much it exports, but what form it exports things in. West Africa produces most of the world cocoa beans. In 2024, Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana together supplied about 60% of global cocoa output. Yet, when you buy chocolate in Europe or Asia, less than 10% of the final value goes back to African farmers. The processing, packaging, branding, and retail are all done abroad. Same patterns appears with minerals. The Democratic Republic of Congo produces most of the world cobalt, a key material for electric vehicle batteries. But the batteries are made in China, Japan, and South Korea. Africa exports raw material at low price and import finished technology at high prices. This is where money quietly leaves the continent of Africa. Processing and manufacturing create better jobs, skills, and tax revenue. Raw exports do not. It is time for African leaders to learn this. In 2024, Africa accounted for less than 2% of global manufacturing output, despite its population and resource base. That gap explains why African economies struggle to absorb millions of young people entering the labor markets every year. Why is more processing not done locally? This is the question a lot of people have been asking. But the thing you need to understand is these several reasons are responsible for this. Number one is electricity is expensive and unreliable in many countries of Africa. Transport networks are weak, access to affordable finance is limited. Policy rule changes too often in most African countries, so investors prefer predictable environment even if raw materials are shipped from long distance. There is also a political angle. Exporting raw materials is faster and simpler for government because building factories take years. Africa sell cheap, buy expensive, trade deficit grows, currency weakens, import becomes costlier, living standard suffers as a result of all this. Global manufacturers and trading hubs benefit while African workers and consumers suffers for this. Until African countries keep more stages of production at home, natural resources will continue to enrich other economies more than Africa itself. That is just the truth. The final pieces of the puzzle is governance, not in a moral sense, but in a practical one. Natural resources do not automatically create a development. Now, institutions decide what happens next. This is why countries with similar resources can end up in completely different situations. Look at Botswana and Sierra Leone. Both have diamond. Botswana built strong contract, transparent revenue system, and long-term savings from their diamond. Diamond money funded schools, roads, and reserves. Sierra Leone for years lacked oversight and suffered conflict. Today, Botswana income per person is several times higher than that of Sierra Leone. The difference was not diamond, it was how decisions were made. Weak institutions allow corruption to thrive. When contracts are secret, royalties are underreported, and money flows outside the country illegally. According to recent estimate, Africa loses tens of billions of dollars every year through illicit financial flows linked to resource extraction. This is money that could fund hospitals, universities, and infrastructure. Debt also plays a role. Resource-backed loans promise fast cash, but they mortgage future earnings. When prices fall, repayment becomes painful. Several African countries now spend more money servicing debt than on health or education in their country. There is also a political cost. Resource wealth can encourage power concentration. Leaders focus on controlling revenue streams rather than building inclusive economies. Over time, there is no longer trust between citizens and the government. Countries that invest in transparency, skills, and diversification can change course of their country. Rwanda focused on governance and services. Morocco invested in manufacturing and renewable energy. Ethiopia built industrial park before recent disruption. The lesson is very clear. Resources are tools, not guarantees that your country is going to do well. Africa is not poor because it lacks wealth. Africa struggles because turning raw wealth into shared prosperity requires system. It is not what Africa has underground that matters, but what it builds above it matters a whole lot. To understand Africa's economic reality, we must look beyond borders. Natural resources do not move themselves. They travel through global systems designed long before many African states existed in their current form. Most African commodities are priced in global markets controlled outside the continent of Africa. Oil is traded in dollars. Metals are priced on exchange in London or Shanghai. This means African countries really controls the value of what they produce. Consider oil again. In 2024, Nigeria earns billions of dollars from crude export, yet it imported most of its refined fuel. Why? because local refineries are not functional. For decades, multinational companies control extraction while Nigeria refineries are not functional. Even with the new Dangote refineries, Nigeria still faces complex market and regulatory challenges. Foreign companies dominate many African resource sectors. They bring capital and technology, but they also negotiate favorable terms. In many countries across Africa, royalty rates are often low compared to global average. Government fears that pushing harder will scare investors away. The result is a delicate balance where Africa sells strategic assets at relatively modest return. China rise has changed the picture, but not the structure. Chinese firms build roads, railways, and ports, often funded by loans. These projects improve infrastructure, but many contracts require African countries to repay using future resource revenue. Western companies follow similar logic, though with different legal framework. Africa often enter negotiations from a weak position with urgent financial need and limited alternatives available. Global corporations and financial centers that control trade routes and pricing mechanisms often smile to the bank, while Africa states that struggle to translate resources extraction into lasting wealth suffer for this. Until African countries gain more control over pricing, contract, and industrial capacity, natural resources will continue to move through systems where the biggest profits are captured far away from the mine and oil field. Africa, no doubt, is the youngest continent in the world. By 2025, Africa's population has exceeded over 1.4 billion people already. More than half of that population is under the age of 25. This should be a powerful advantage. Instead, it has become an economic stress test to the continent. Every year, millions of young Africans enter the labor market. But resources-driven economies do not create enough jobs for these young people. Oil extraction, large-scale mining, and plantation agriculture are capital-intensive. They generate revenue without absorbing large number of workers. China, Vietnam, and Indonesia created millions of manufacturing jobs by producing goods for global market. Their factories acted as stepping stones, moving people from low-income farming to stable industrial work. Africa, unfortunately, always skips this stage. In many African countries, young people end up in the informal sector. These activities keep people alive, but rarely build wealth. According to recent estimates, over 80% of employment in sub-Saharan Africa is informal. Informality means low productivity, unstable income, and limited tax revenue. Universities produce graduates, but economies do not always provide matching opportunities for these graduates. In countries like Nigeria and many other African countries, engineers drive taxis, graduates migrate abroad, skills live faster than industry grows. Resource wealth raises expectation, but economic structure cannot meet them. When global commodity prices fall, government cuts spending, youth unemployment rises, social tension increases in many of these African countries. This has happened in places like Nigeria and Kenya. Meanwhile, countries with fewer resources but stronger industrial bases move ahead faster than Africa with natural resources. Bangladesh exports garments worth tens of billions of dollars annually, employing millions of people. Africa, despite its cotton production, imports most of its clothing. Who benefits from this gap? Foreign manufacturers and importing nations benefit a whole lot, while African youth trapped between education and underemployment suffers for this. Who is to be blamed? The government, of course. Until Africa builds industries that can absorb its young population, resources alone will not translate into prosperity. African leaders need to understand that wealth underground does not automatically create ladders above the ground. Africa is not just one economy, it is 54 countries, each with its own rules, currencies, borders, and policies. This fragmentation quietly weakens the continent's ability to convert resources into power. I will explain this later in this video. In 2024, only about 15 to 18% of Africa trade happened within the continent itself. Compare that with Europe, where over 60% of trade is intra-regional, meaning it happens within Europe, or Asia, where it exceeds over 50%. Africa countries mostly trade raw materials with distant market instead of finished goods within its region. Africa countries mostly trade raw materials with distant market instead of finished goods within the continent. A factory in Germany can easily sell across Europe. A factory in Kenya faces tariffs, logistic barriers, and currency risk when exported to neighboring Africa countries. Without large integrated market, manufacturing will struggle to grow in Africa. Infrastructure also reflects fragmentation in Africa. Railways often run from mines to ports, not between African cities or countries. Roads connect extraction sites to export terminals rather than regional industrial hubs. The physical map of Africa still mirrors colonial trade routes today. The Africa Continental Free Trade Area aims to change this. If fully implemented, it could create a market of over 1.3 billion people with a combined GDP exceeding $3 trillion. But progress is still very slow. Policy disagreement, protectionism, and weak enforcement limits these projects, limits this dream. Fragmentation also affects bargaining power. When countries negotiate separately with multinational companies or global powers, they tend to accept weaker terms. A unified regional bloc could demand better contracts, higher royalties, and technology transfer. Divided countries cannot. That is just the truth. External buyers who negotiate with smaller and weaker partners benefit from this system a whole lot. African resources are vast, but its economic space is fragmented. Until African countries trade more with each other, coordinate policies, and build shared industries, natural wealth will remain scattered rather than consolidated in the continent of Africa. And that is one of the most overlooked reasons why a resource-rich continent still struggles to feel rich. One uncomfortable reasons Africa struggles with wealth is how politics often works in practice. In many African countries, politics is less about growing the economy and more about dividing what already exists. Natural resources intensify this problem. When oil, minerals, or gas bring in large sums of money, political competition shifts from productivity to control. Being in power becomes the fastest route to wealth. This changes how leaders behave. Instead of focusing on expanding industries or improving exports, politicians and government prioritize distributing positions, contracts, and favors to maintain loyalty. Ministry becomes tools for balancing ethnic, regional, or political interests rather than engines of growth. Take oil-producing states, for instance. Revenues often flow straight to the central government. Local communities see environmental damage but little development. This fuels resentment and instability. Niger Delta is a clear example. Decades of oil production generated billions, yet local infrastructure and living standards lag behind national averages. In contrast, countries with limited resources often rely on taxation. When citizens pay taxes, they demand services from the government they pay taxes to. That pressure improves governance over time. This political structure rewards short-term thinking. Leaders focus on election cycles or regime survival. Industrial policies, education reform, and innovation take years to pay up, so they receive less attention from the government and politicians. Political elites and connected businesses benefit largely from the system. Until African politics shifts from sharing revenue to growing value, resources will continue to deepen political competition instead of national prosperity. Africa does not lose money through bad trade deals. It also loses money quietly through capital flights. Each year, large sums of money leave the continent through profit repatriation, tax avoidance, and illicit financial flow. According to recent estimates, Africa loses tens of billions of dollars annually through these channels. This is far more than what it receives in foreign aids. African governments collect minimal revenue even though the resources came from their soil. Wealthy individuals also move money offshore. Political uncertainty, weak institutions, and unstable currencies encourage capital flee. The result is a shortage of domestic investments. Whereas in East Asia, profit earned locally were often reinvested locally, building factories, skills, and supply chains. In Africa, profits frequently exceeds the system. Stopping capital flight requires transparency, legal reform, and political will. Without it, Africa's resources will keep feeding other economies more than its own. In today's world, wealth is less about what you dig out of the ground and more about what you know how to do with what you dig out of the ground. Africa exports raw materials. Other regions export ideas, technology, and systems. Africa has deposits of lithium, but battery chemistry, software, and manufacturing expertise are done abroad. The highest profits are earned far from the mine. Education system in Africa often focus on theories rather than application. Research funding is limited. Innovation ecosystem remain very small. Without technical depth, countries remain suppliers, not leaders. Countries that escape poverty invested heavily in skills before becoming rich. They train engineers, technicians, and managers. Africa is still catching up. Some African countries are still catching up. Some are not doing anything about it at all. Resources can fund this transition, but only if used deliberately by these African leaders.